The air in the underground chamber doesn't smell like a church. It smells like cold iron, old smoke, and something living that shouldn't be trapped in stone. Something sour that sticks to the back of the throat and refuses to leave. It's 1571. A 19-year-old woman is chained to a wall beneath the Kremlin complex. Her name is Marfa Vasilievna. Also back in 12 days ago, Moscow crowned her Tsarina of all Russia. Today she is not a queen. She is a question. A suspicion. A problem that needs to be solved. The chains have eaten her wrists raw. Her hands have been above her head long enough that her shoulders burn like fire even in the cold. When she shifts her weight, the metal bites deeper. When she tries to rest, she can't. The stone behind her is wet with centuries. In the corners of the room, men in black robes murmur prayers that don't sound like comfort. They sound like counting, like rehearsing, like spells said by people who aren't sure whether they're serving God or just power. On a wooden table, tools sit in neat rows. Some are familiar tongs, hooks, clamps. So are not. Here are glass vials too, filled with liquids that catch torchlight and shiver like oil. Marfa doesn't know what any of it is for. She only knows what it means when men arrange things carefully. 3 weeks ago she was the prize of the greatest bride selection Moscow had ever staged. More than 2,000 girls were brought in from across the realm. Daughters of noble houses, minor families, provincial bloodlines that had never seen the inside of a palace. They were inspected, compared, filtered, narrowed down like livestock in a market. The lucky ones were told they had been chosen to serve God by sending the Tsar. Maya's father wept when the messengers arrived. Her mother's hands shook as she sewed wedding cloth. Overnight, the Sabakins rose from small nobility to the center of the world. And now Marfa hangs in a room that officially does not exist, watched by men who are not quite monks and not quite soldiers. The Oprichniki, Ivan's personal enforcers. Men who ride black horses dressed like funerals and swear loyalty so absolute it cancels family, law, and conscience. They call it cleansing. They call it protection. They hang a dog's head from their saddle to symbolize how they bite the Tsar's enemies. But the enemies they bite most easily are the ones who cannot fight back. Marfa doesn't know she will be dead within days. She doesn't know that the sick is draining her isn't a mystery at all. She doesn't know that the treatment she's been given tiny doses repeated, controlled may have been the experiment itself. What she knows is that her husband is here. Ivan Vasilievich stands in the shadows, not pacing like a worried man, not shouting like a furious one. He is watching the way a person watches a fire, calm, patient, interested in what happens when something beautiful collapses. Tell me again, he says softly, almost kindly, about the plot against me. There is no plot, go Sudar. Marfa whispers. She has said it so many times it no longer sounds like language. It sounds like breathing. Ivan steps closer, just enough for torchlight to touch his face. His expression isn't rage, it's curiosity. Then why are you sick, my little bird? Why do you fade while my physicians shrug and blame air and humors and fate? She tries to swallow. Her throat is dry. I don't know. That is the most dangerous answer in a court like this. Ivan doesn't need proof. He needs a story. He needs a name. He needs a sacrifice that turns his fear into control. And this is where Hollywood will never follow him. You've heard the public Ivan, the conqueror, the builder, the first ruler to claim the titles or as something more than a crown and identity. You've heard the version where his terror is political, where it's about boyars and borders and rebellion. But you probably weren't taught the private Ivan, the one who turned marriage into an interrogation room, the one who treated women like they were both trophies and traps, like they were potential blessings and potential knives, like their bodies were a territory to occupy and their families were collateral. Ivan married again and again. The exact number depends on which record you trust, because even the church struggled to keep up with what he demanded. Some wives died quickly. Some vanished into convent walls. Some were erased so cleanly that later chroniclers reduced them to a sentence. And when the pattern repeats enough times, it stops looking like fate. It starts looking like method. Here is what a bride show really was in Ivan's Russia. A message went out and families understood it as an order even if it was written like one. Bring your daughters. Present them. Let them be measured, examined, judged. Refusal was not a neutral act. Refusal looked like disloyalty. Refusal looked like hiding. And in an era when suspicion was enough to lose land, lose freedom, whose life most families obeyed. Girls were inspected for health, for appearance, for fitness. Their family ties were mapped. Their relatives were searched for old grudges, for unconnections, anyone who had ever spoken carelessly. Even if the girl was perfect, a cousin could ruin her. Then, once the finalists were brought to Moscow, the real isolation began. They were separated from home, put under watch, fed, dressed, instructed, corrected. Anything they said in fear could be used against them. Anything they did to survive could be called deceit. By the time the Tsar finally looked at them, they were already learning the first lesson: you did not belong to yourself anymore. And Marfa, by the logic of the system, was the winner. She was selected, blessed, married, crowned, and then she began to weaken. In a normal world, a young bride growing ill would trigger care, concern, protection. In Ivan's world, it triggered an investigation, because sickness could mean poison, poison could mean enemies, enemies could mean a purge, and a purge could mean confiscations, executions, an excuse to terrorize the court back into silence. So Ivan asked the same question in different forms. Who did this? Who touched you? Who do you speak to? Who do you love? Who do you fear? And Marfa, who had no power, no allies, no safe truth to offer, had only one answer: I don't know. That's when the tools on the table stop being theater. That's when the men in black stop sounding like priests and start sounding like a machine. And Ivan watches. Not like a husband, like an examiner. This is the part that makes his reign feel less like a dark personality and more like a design system. Because Ivan didn't only destroy enemies. He destroyed certainty. He destroyed safety. He destroyed the idea that anyone, especially a woman near the throne, could ever relax. Even if Marfa had been innocent, innocence didn't protect her. Innocence was useless. All that mattered was whether her suffering could produce a result. A confession. A name. A reason. And here's the cruel twist: if she gave him a name, it would likely be the wrong one. Someone would die anyway. Someone always did. Because the point wasn't justice. The point was control. And when Marfa died soon after, we can ruin Russia didn't get a careful explanation. Russia got a story that served Ivan. If he wanted, her death could become witchcraft, conspiracy, a hidden cabal inside his own palace. If he wanted, it could become proof that he was surrounded by traitors. And if he wanted, it could justify a new wave of terror that didn't need evidence, only fear. That is what makes the bride shows feel so sick in hindsight. They weren't just a way to find a wife. They were a way to pull families into the palace like fish into a net. You offer your daughter. You gain favor. You rise. And then if the Tsar turns on her, your entire bloodline becomes suspect. You can be punished for her illness. You can be punished for her death. You can be punished for the story he chooses to tell about it. Marriage in that system is not a union. It's a weapon. And Marfa is not the only one. Some wives were sent to convents. People like to hear that and think it was gentle. They picture prayer, peace, a quiet life. But a convent in this context could mean a cage that lasts decades. A new name. A new identity. Your old life treated like a sin. Letters controlled. Visitors denied. Your body alive, your person erased. Other women didn't even get that. Some were discarded fast. Because a ruler like Ivan didn't simply fear betrayal. He feared the feeling of being fooled. And when he believed he'd been fooled, the punishment had to be public enough to scare everyone watching. And everyone was always watching. That's the part people forget when they reduce Ivan to a single dramatic moment: one painting, one blow, one son dying in his arms. Ivan's terror wasn't only explosive. It was daily. It was administrative. It was something you could build a schedule around. And women were wrapped in it in a special way because they could be blamed for things they didn't control. Judged for things they couldn't prove. Punished for things someone else decided to imagine. Marfa's last days were not a romantic tragedy. They were a lesson. A lesson to the court: no one is safe. A lesson to the noble families: your daughters are not shields. A lesson to Russia: even the Tsarina can become disposable the moment she stops being useful. And that's why this story matters. Because when people say Ivan the Terrible, they usually mean politics, territory, violence between men. But power doesn't only show itself on battlefields. Sometimes it shows itself in a locked room beneath a palace, where a 19-year-old bride is chained to stone, and the man who owns the state watches her suffering like it's evidence. So remember Marfa Sobakane. Not as a footnote. Not as the wife who died quickly. Remember her as a human being who was selected, isolated, celebrated, and then destroyed by the same system that crowned her. And remember what that system was designed to do: find women, separate them, break them, dispose of them. And they rewrite the story so it looks like fate instead of policy. Because the scariest part of Ivan's reign isn't that he was violent. It's that violence became procedure. And procedures don't need rage. They don't need passion. They just need permission. Marfa didn't have permission to live. She only had permission to be used. If you want more stories like this, the ones that didn't get painted in heroic coils, the ones that don't fit the neat myth, subscribe. Share it with someone who thinks they already know Ivan the Terrible. And tell me where you're watching from, because somewhere in the official history, Marfa is still being reduced to a sentence. But she deserved more than a sentence. She deserved to be remembered. Marfa's body doesn't give Ivan what he wants. Not at first. Because pain doesn't always produce clarity. Sometimes it produces only shock. Sometimes it produces only silence. Sometimes it produces a kind of empty obedience that looks like surrender, but contains no information at all. She hangs there and her mind does what human minds do when there is no escape. It begins to drift away from the room, away from the chains, away from the chanting that keeps time with her breathing, away from the men who lean close and speak as if their words can pull a confession out of her ribs. She tries to remember the last moment she felt safe, not happy safe. The last ordinary afternoon in her father's house, when the world was still the size of a village road. The last time she heard her mother's voice without fear behind it. The last time her name belonged to her. But that's the trick of Ivan's world. He doesn't just punish bodies. He attacks memory. He makes your past feel like a lie and your future feel like a future feel like a locked door. And when you can't see either direction, you stop being a person, stop being a container. A vessel for whatever story the Tsar needs. Ivan steps closer. He does not touch her. He doesn't need to. That's what people misunderstand about absolute power. It doesn't always strike. Sometimes it simply stands there and lets everyone else do the striking role. It watches and chooses when to intervene. Who did it? He asks again, like a prayer. Like a lullaby. Marfa's lips are cracked. Her voice is barely air. I don't know. Ivan doesn't flinch, but something hardens behind his eyes, not anger. Disappointment. The kind a man feels when a tool fails to produce the result he expected. He turns his head slightly and the room changes. The opportunity shift. The heat in the chamber spikes as someone moves a brazier closer. The iron on the table is no longer just iron. It is a promise. And somewhere deep in Marfa, her body understands something her mind has finished forming into words. This isn't about truth. This is about giving Ivan a reason. If she gives him a name, he gets an excuse to kill whoever he already wanted to kill. If she gives him nothing, he gets an excuse to widen the circle until someone breaks. That is how terror works. It doesn't seek accuracy. It seeks obedience. It seeks motion. It seeks a public demonstration that the ruler's fear can become everyone else's catastrophe. So Marfa stays with the only thing she can still control. Silence. And the silence enrages him precisely because it denies him a clean narrative. It forces him to improvise. And Ivan hates improvisation when it comes to power. He likes structure. He likes rituals. He likes systems that make his violence feel like law. So he creates one. Over the next days, the palace becomes a fever dream of official concern and unofficial panic. Physicians are summoned. Priests are summoned. Old women who know herbs are summoned. Foreign doctors are pulled from ambassadorial households and ask questions they cannot answer safely. Marfa is moved from the chamber back into the rooms reserved for Tsarina, but they are no longer bridal chambers. They are a medical ward with guards. Her bedding smells clean, but the air is watched. Her food is served like medicine. Her water tastes strange, metallic sometimes, bitter sometimes, as if someone is measuring her life in grains. She grows weaker anyway. There are reckons what survives of them that describe the symptoms the way bureaucracies describe dying. Weakness, tremors, loss of appetite, dizziness, vomiting, confusion, fainting, fever without a cause, pain that moves around the body like a living thing. And Ivan watches. He visits. He asks questions. He places himself at the edge of the bed and studies her face the way a man studies weather. When she can't hold herself upright, he doesn't show tenderness. He shows interest. When she struggles to speak, he doesn't lean in like a husband. He leans in like an interrogator trying to catch the one word that will justify everything. By the 12th day, she can barely rise. By the 15th day, she is gone. And then Ivan does what Ivan always does when something near him dies. He turns it into proof. He does not say, "My poor wife." He does not say, "This is a tragedy." He does not say, "We must mourn." He says, "Someone did this." And in a court built on fear, the sentence is enough to become reality. The Subalterns are investigated, not because evidence exists, because the investigation itself is the punishment. Because once the Tsar points at a family, the pointing is the crime. Servants are arrested. Midwives are questioned. Attendants are beaten until they confess to whatever story the interrogator suggests. Some names are produced because names always get produced when pain is applied long enough. And those names become a list. A list becomes a purge. A purge becomes a message to every noble family in Russia. If you rise too quickly, you can be cut down just as fast. If you get close to the throne may devour you. Your daughter can be crowned on Monday and used as an excuse for your execution by Friday. Because Marfa's death isn't only a death, it's an opportunity. And Ivan never wastes opportunities. This is why his marriages feel less like relationships and more like state policy. Each wife is a symbol. Each wife is a lever. Each wife is a potential pretext. And every time one of them disappears through illness, through a convent, through a sudden accusation, Ivan gets to clean house. He gets to take land, remove rivals, break families, remind the court that nothing is permanent except his authority. That is what the rich Nina was built for. Not just to punish traitors, to keep everyone uncertain, to make loyalty meaningless because suspicion can be manufactured at will. It's important to say this plainly because it's the part people avoid. A system like Ivan's doesn't require constant battle. It requires constant vulnerability. And women were the easiest targets because their bodies could be turned into evidence. Their fertility could be turned into suspicion. Their illness could be turned into conspiracy. Their silence could be turned into guilt. When a man holds absolute power, he doesn't just control the state. He controls what counts as truth. Marfa's death doesn't slow Ivan down. It accelerates him. He remarries. Quickly, because he doesn't marry for companionship. He marries because marriage is a mechanism. A ritual that allows him to pull new blood into his orbit and test it. Use it. Break it. Remove it. And you begin to see the pattern like teeth marks. A wife is chosen. She is isolated. She is monitored. Her body becomes state property. Her behavior becomes a test. If she fails, she is corrected. If correction fails, she is removed. And after removal, someone else pays. The family, the attendants, the servants, the rivals who happen to be convenient, the court itself, shaken into obedience. Years later, foreigners writing home describe Moscow as a place where even joy looks scared, where people smile carefully, where silence is safer than speech, where weddings are not celebrations but political events everyone survives by pretending to believe in. And that's the point. Ivan's system was always chasing a world where pretending becomes instinct, where people lie without thinking, where people fear without being told, where people comply before anyone asks. That is what it means for terror to become governance. So what happens to the women after Marfa? Some vanish into convents and live long lives that are not lives. A cell, a new name, a schedule of prayers used as a muzzle. A woman who was once a reina reduced to sister and forbidden to speak her own past aloud. Some die quickly and publicly in ways that teach the crowd the lesson as much as they punish the victim. Some are accused of sexual sins that conveniently justify their removal while painting Ivan as the injured party. Because that's another trick of absolute power. It insists on being the victim even while it destroys you. And then, there are the thousands of unnamed women, wives and daughters of boyars. Women of cities like Novgorod, women whose bodies were used as pressure, as punishment, as reward, as entertainment, as warning. And names don't survive because the system was designed to erase them. And this is where the story has to end, because it always ends the same way for the victims. There is no final courtroom moment. No justice. No neat verdict. No apology from history. There is only the record that remains when power stops controlling paper. Marfa Sobek A is remembered today, mostly as the wife who died after 2 weeks. That phrase is the final violence done to her, because it turns a human life into a timeline. It turns a young woman into a plot point in a man's biography. It makes the system invisible again. So here is the ending she deserves. Marfa was not cursed. She was not weak. She did not fail some mystical test of fate. She was selected by a system that treated women like objects, inserted into a court that treated suspicion like oxygen, and destroyed by a ruler who confused control with safety. She lived long enough to be crowned and short enough to be used. And when she died, she did not bring peace. She brought another wave of terror, because that was the function her death served. That is what empires do to women. They use them, break them, bury them, and then tell you the stories if it's just how history was. It wasn't how history was. It was how power chose to be. If you remember Marfa now for an end stays in your head after the video ends, then the system fails a little, because forgetting is the final stage of control, and remembering is the only kind of justice some victims ever get. So remember her. Remember that a crown can be a trap. Remember that wife can be a political position with a death rate. Remember that terror doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes Erez Velveton speaks softly and asks the same question again and again until the room itself becomes a weapon. And remember that behind every famous tyrant, there are usually women whose stories were cut out of the official version because they make the truth too ugly to admire. If you want more of the stories that power tried to bury, subscribe. And tell me where you're watching from, because in 1571, in Moscow, Marfa Sobek never got to choose where she stood. But you can choose to make sure she isn't reduced to a footnote again. And here is the part history almost never lingers on. What happens after the terror works? Because Ivan did not need to torture forever. He only needed to torture enough for the lesson to sink into the bones of everyone watching. After Marfa Sobek's death, something subtle but irreversible changed at court. Foreign diplomats noticed it first. Their letters began to shift in tone. Earlier reports described Moscow as brutal but functional, violent but legible. After 1571, the language darkens. They write that people speak more quietly now, that laughter sounds rehearsed, that no one finishes a sentence unless absolutely necessary. Because Marfa's death made something clear. Even being chosen by the Tsar did not protect you. In fact, it marked you. Before Marfa, a bride show was dangerous. After Marfa, it was a death sentence with a variable timeline. Families still sent their daughters. They had no choice. But now they did so, like people offering sacrifices to a fire they knew could not be appeased. Mothers stopped sewing wedding dresses with joy. They sewed them like burial shrouds. Fathers stopped boasting. They drank. And the women who returned home unchosen did not celebrate. They survived something. They had stood close enough to power to smell it. And they understood what proximity meant. For the rest of their lives, they would dream of corridors without windows. Ivan meanwhile refined the system. He learned that he didn't need evidence. He didn't need consistency. He didn't need truth. He needed plausibility. A wife could die of illness. A family could be guilty of witchcraft. A woman could be executed for immorality. And once the explanation existed, no matter how thin, the violence became lawful. That is the most dangerous thing absolute power ever learns. Not how to kill, but how to make killing administrative. By the time Ivan reaches the final years of his reign, the machinery no longer requires his constant attention. The oprichniki know what to do. The court knows how to react. The church knows how to bless it. The population knows how to stay silent. The system runs itself. That is why the suffering feels endless when you read the records. Because it was chaos. It was routine. And routine is how horror survives long enough to feel normal. Marfa Sobek becomes a template. Not intentionally honored. Not openly discussed. But quietly referenced. She did not last, people say. As Marfa did, they whisper. Her name becomes shorthand for what happens when the Tsar decides a woman's body has more political value as a corpse than as a living person. And then slowly, even that whisper fades. Because terror does not only kill people. It kills memory. By the time Ivan dies, the women who knew Marfa personally are gone, dead, exiled, or silent. The servants who watched her weaken have learned that survival requires forgetting. The scribes compress her life into a line. Marfa Vasilievna Sobakina's, wife of Ivan IV, died shortly after marriage. That is how history erases suffering. Not by denying it, by minimizing it. Centuries later, textbooks will talk about Ivan's reforms, his conquests, his cruelty in the abstract. They will mention his wives like weather events. They will show Ray Pin's painting of Ivan and his son and ask you to feel pity for the tyrant. They will not ask you to imagine a 19-year-old girl chained in a chamber that officially did not exist, being poisoned slowly while her husband watched to see what would happen. They will not ask you to sit with that, because sitting with that ruins the myth, and myths are easier to manage than systems. But here is the truth that remains once the romance and the distance are stripped away. Marfa Sobakina did not die because Ivan was mad. She did not die because of superstition. She did not die because of fate. She died because she was useful. Useful as a test. Useful as a warning. Useful as a justification for terror already waiting to be unleashed. Her body became evidence in a trial that never needed a verdict. And when she was gone, the system moved on to the next woman. That is why this story matters. Not because Ivan was uniquely evil. History is full of cruel men. But because Ivan built something scalable. A structure where women's bodies could be turned into instruments of state power. Where intimacy became surveillance. Where marriage became interrogation. Where silence became survival. Those structures did not die with him. They reappear whenever power becomes unchecked. Whenever fear replaces law. Whenever women are treated as symbols rather than people. Whenever violence is reframed as necessity. So if this story leaves you unsettled, it should. Because Marfa Sobakina is not just a tragedy from the 16th century. She is a warning about what happens when a system decides that some lives are expendable in service of order. She lived 19 years. She was Tsarina for 12 days. She was poisoned for 15. And she was forgotten for centuries because remembering her would mean admitting what power really does when no one can stop it. Now you know her name. And as long as her name is spoken, the system that killed her never fully wins. If you want the story's history tried to compress into footnotes, stay here. Because forgetting is how this kind of violence repeats. And remembering is how it finally runs out of silence. And here is the final thing that must be said, because without it the story is still incomplete. Ivan's system did not collapse when he died. It softened. It mutated. It learned to wear cleaner language. After 1584, Russia did not suddenly become humane. The machinery Ivan perfected absolute authority. Unaccountable enforcement. Ritualized fear simply passed into other hands. The Otrichnina was officially dissolved, but its logic survived. Surveillance without oversight. Punishment without trial. Women treated as vessels for alliance, lineage, and leverage rather than as people. The brides no longer hung in chains beneath Alexandrov. They were married off, locked away, silenced, traded. Less spectacular, more respectable, just as effective. That is how violence matures. It stops looking like cruelty and starts looking like tradition. Marfa Sobakina disappears from official memory not because her death was unimportant, but because it was too revealing. To remember her honestly would require admitting that the Russian state was willing to destroy an 19-year-old girl, deliberately unmethodically, to stabilize power. States do not like that kind of mirror, so they tell different stories. They say Ivan was mad. They say the era was barbaric. They say it was a different time. All of these explanations are comforting because they make the violence feel distant, accidental, unrepeatable. That Marfa's death was not accidental. It was not chaotic. It was not irrational. It was procedural. She was selected, prepared, isolated, tested, poisoned, disposed of. Every step documented. Every step justified. Every step deniable. That is the part modern audiences struggle with most. We want monsters to be wild, unpredictable, obviously insane. We want cruelty to look like rage. But the most dangerous cruelty looks like paperwork. And this is why the women in Ivan's life matter more than his wars. Because conquest tells you where power expands. But marriage tells you how power behaves at home. What Ivan did to Kazan was brutality. What he did to Marfa was governance. She did not threaten the throne. She did not plot rebellion. She did not fail as a ruler. She simply existed within reach of a man who needed absolute certainty and found uncertainty intolerable. And when uncertainty cannot be eliminated, it is punished. That is the lesson Ivan taught his court. That is the lesson his successors absorbed. That is the lesson empires everywhere keep relearning. Marfa Bakane had no manifesto, no rebellion, no last speech. Her resistance was quieter. She endured long enough for the system to reveal itself. She died young enough that the lie that it was illness, and it was God's will could not fully hold. And centuries later, her bones still told the truth when people finally bothered to listen. So remember her, not as a footnote, not as a victim in a catalogue of horrors, but as evidence. Evidence that absolute power does not merely kill its enemies. It consumes its intimates. Evidence that when women disappear from history, it is rarely because nothing happened to them but because too much did. Evidence that systems like Ivan's do not announce themselves as evil. They announce themselves as necessary. Marfa Bakane was 19 years old. She was arena for 12 days. She never ruled. She never chose. She never escaped. But her story exposes the architecture of terror more clearly than any battlefield ever could. And now that you know it, the silence around her is broken. That is how remembering begins. Not with heroism. Not with triumph. But with refusing to let the erasure finish its work. There is nothing dramatic left to add after this. No final twist. No hidden redemption. No moment where the system realizes what it has done and recoils in shame. History does not work that way. Marfa Bakane did not become a symbol in her lifetime. She did not inspire rebellion. Her death did not immediately stop the terror. The Oprichniki did not lay down their black robes. Ivan did not repent. Russia did not change course. What happened instead was quieter and more honest. Her name was written once in a marriage register, once more in a death record, and then almost nowhere at all. That is how power prefers its victims recorded just enough to be administratively complete, forgotten enough to be morally convenient. For centuries, Ivan the Terrible was remembered as a conqueror, a state builder, a flawed genius. His wives were listed as dates and names, interchangeable, unexplained. When historians asked why so many of them died, the answers were vague: illness, fate, God's will, the dangers of the age. No one asked why illness followed marriage with such precision. No one asked why fate only struck young women. No one asked why God's will aligned so perfectly with political convenience. Because asking those questions would force a harder conclusion. That this was not madness. That this was not excess. That this was not an accident of a brutal century. It was design. Marfa Bakane was selected because she was suitable. She was destroyed because suitability is never enough for absolute power. Power does not want adequacy. It wants certainty. And when certainty cannot be achieved, it manufactures guilt. Her death allowed Ivan to purge a family, to reassert control, to remind the court that intimacy offered no protection. That was the point. And that is why her story matters. Not because it is uniquely horrific, but because it is disturbingly familiar. The methods change. The language softens. The chains become invisible. But the logic remains. When a system is built on fear, women become tests. When authority is unchecked, intimacy becomes a liability. When power feels threatened, it does not argue, it eliminates. Marfa Bakane never ruled Russia. But Russia ruled her body, her health, her future, her death. And then tried to rule her memory. That part failed. Because remembering her as something Ivan never allowed, it restores personhood to someone the state treated as expendable. She was 19 years old. She had parents who celebrated her wedding. She had a life that lasted just long enough to be used. And now finally, she has a name that means something again. Not as Ivan's wife. Not as his arena. But as proof. Proof that absolute power always reveals itself most clearly in how it treats the powerless closest to it. This is where the story ends. Not with justice. Not with resolution. But with refusal. Refusal to let silence finish the job. That is the only ending history ever gives us, and the only one we can choose to accept or reject. Marfa Bakane deserved to be remembered. Now she is.